Welcome to Veriff Voices, where we explore all things in the world of digital identity, including fraud, compliance, the latest tech innovations, and how the right digital identity provider can help you acquire more customers and power business growth. My name is Chris Hooper. I am Global Director of Content Marketing here at Veriff, and today we are talking specifically about fraud. Someone who has been at the forefront of this fight is our guest today. David Divitt, who is Veriff's Senior Director of Fraud Prevention and Experience, has in the course of his career spent more than 25 years enabling firms like MasterCard and ACI to help their customers successfully overcome the ever-evolving challenges posed by online fraudsters. In this conversation today, David will outline what he considers to be some of today's major fraud trends. He'll provide some actionable tips for businesses to help stay ahead of the game, and why he chose to join Veriff to make the online world a safer place. So, David, first of all, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
I sort of, I had a little allusion there, I guess, to some of your experience. But it'd be great if you just elaborated a little bit, just to give us a sort of just a flavour of your journey, and I guess if you could sort of lead that to why you joined Veriff and what you hope to achieve here, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So not quite at 25 years, but somewhere in the region, over 20. It was around 2000 actually that I really got into this career focused on financial crime and really payments for this whole period up until joining Veriff. So yeah, like you mentioned, I've been involved with financial crime and payments across a number of spaces, from vendors of solutions and from users of solutions. I've been kind of a fraud analyst myself, working through alerts, trying to stop the baddies. And so I've seen both sides of that picture, and I think that's what's been really interesting throughout my career. And yeah, I mean, what really intrigued me about joining Veriff is when I started to look at my history, which is, as I say, very payments focused. And particularly in the last, say, 5 years, I've really focused on the money mule problem a lot. And what I increasingly realized when I started thinking about Veriff and where they sit in the kind of fraud attack chain, I realized that when tools like Veriff, like IDV, really fall down, you get money mules, you get money laundering, you get fraud in financial fraud. So what really intrigued me about Veriff is that I'm stepping back one step in the chain, which gives you a whole lot more potential of stopping things downstream. So it's, again, stepping up a little bit, looking broader, and looking at one step earlier in this very typical chain that I would be used to.
And what is it that you think Veriff in particular has here, or can offer in this sort of fight against fraud? Is there any sort of characteristics that you would draw out, or that sort of attracted you in the first place to join, that you would sort of call out here?
Yeah, I mean, so Veriff is, I think, a really interesting company, particularly because its approach using technology, using very modern technology to fight this type of fraud and these type of issues, to provide the services we provide. I think more and more, and we'll talk a lot about this throughout the podcast today, but more and more as technology enables new things, new use cases, new businesses, we need to use technology to keep up with that, right? So modernizing some of these things that have been done in a very manual way for a long time is incredibly important. It will facilitate so much more. So Veriff being part of that, I think, on that kind of cutting edge is really interesting. I think the thing that interests me, a lot about Veriff is how we can help really give businesses trust when they're moving into these new spaces, especially. A lot of these businesses that we're helping may be just getting into this digital space for the first time. Maybe they were more of a traditional business, prior to COVID, for instance, and now they're having to digitize. So they're moving into a new space. They can't rely on the same kind of tried and tested methods of manual verification, for instance. And so that trust that we can bring is super important. And once you get trust, once you've given that to a business, what you end up with is you're enabling them to do more, to do different things, to expand their offering, to take a few more risks that maybe they weren't sure they could do before, and therefore grow their business. So the trust, the enablement, and then what that ultimately gives them is flexibility. I think that's what's really interesting about Veriff's offering to me, and about this space in general.
Yeah, and it seems to me that, I mean, trust is at the root of all that, isn't it? I think it feels like, and that really is at the heart of what the offering is to our customers. I suppose they're trusting us with some very important data of theirs and everything else. So it's it's a really sort of key part of what we do. And what, just sort of turning that question on its head, I suppose. And what is it that you aim to bring personally to that service and to sort of enhance it in a way?
Yeah, well, really related to the kind of first points that I was making. First and foremost, I hope I can bring a bit of a different perspective. Coming from a tangential but related area, I think bringing that different perspective is really important. So yeah, I think definitely, and I think once you start to look at this problem from different lenses, you can start to broaden the vision. You can look wider than some of the focused techniques that you've used in the past, and maybe bring a little bit of that to what we do. So really, once you put those two things together, you can start to think of a more holistic approach to IDV and fraud in general, right? So looking at ways that we can think broader than just stopping a fake document, for instance. What does that lead to, and how can we give our customers tools to stop more than just that? Bringing in different types of affirmations, looking at addresses, looking at devices, looking at the whole host of data that we can use as part of one of these sessions to help further stop issues for our clients down the line.
That's really good. We'll get into sort of some of the trends in a moment. Just one last question on this actually is around kind of your metrics for success, I suppose, is the next question. I think it's sometimes it's hard to know what fraud has been stopped if it hasn't been stopped, in a sense, right? So it's a really sort of hard thing to quantify. So I just wonder how you frame that, and that sort of measurement of success is a really sort of interesting piece of this, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think feedback in itself is a whole other topic that we could discuss for a long time. And it's something that a lot of businesses struggle with. And it's something that actually is going to be a focus of mine as well. But first and foremost, happy customers is what we're after. Because if the customer is happy, then that means we're doing the things that they need to have the trust, enable new business, to enable those things that we talked about earlier. So happy customers, absolutely. I think also you can't really deliver good product and solid strategy unless you have a happy internal team, right? So you need to make sure that your teams are happy and engaged and enthusiastic, and that's definitely something I've noticed immediately from joining Veriff. There's a lot of really engaged people. They enjoy the problem space and they're passionate about it. And then obviously disappointed fraudsters, right? That's what we, at the end of the day, that's what we're really hoping to do, is just to put a few more of those roadblocks in front of a fraudster to make them change, to basically change the ROI for the fraudster. And that's the name of the game. So unfortunately, it's pretty close to impossible to completely stop fraud. What you end up doing, picture it like a balloon. You squeeze the balloon in the middle. It doesn't get smaller. It kind of pops out other places. But what you need to do is shift that paradigm for a fraudster, make their ROI less attractive so that they go different places. And that's really what we want to do here.
That's fascinating. I like that. And I specifically liked what you mentioned there around sort of the internal teams and having, and it's definitely something that I've noticed in my time at Veriff actually, is that the whole organization is sort of channeled around this purpose, if you like, of preventing fraud and helping businesses to do so. So I really like, so let's get into that then now. I mean, what are some of the big fraud trends, if you like? I mean, what are sort of some of the businesses that are out there, some of our customer base and so on? What are the things that they most need to be aware of, would you say, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think top of the list is digitization. All right. So the more we digitize services that have never been there, the more fraudsters will find weaknesses and threats and poke holes in it. That's just the nature of it, right? Whenever you transition, and it's not unique to digitization, it's unique to any change, right? As soon as you change something, you're going to enable new things that weren't possible before, both for good people, customers, as well as bad people, fraudsters. So digitization brings new threats, and I think people need to be very, very aware of that if they're not already. One benefit of digitization is speed, basically. Speed to market, speed of services, right? You could never think of getting authenticated or validated, your identity validated for a new product in seconds before, even if you're standing in front of someone, right? Seconds is still a very fast time to do this. Nowadays, we can. So what does that mean? Faster services means faster fraud, I'm afraid. And again, these things just go hand in hand. So while it's an amazing and massive benefit for the general public and enables us to do so many more things, it also enables fraudsters to commit what they're doing very, very quickly. And you see this everywhere. I'm very aware of it because of the work that I was doing prior to Veriff. We saw how quickly money can move from account to account to account once it's stolen, how quickly it can be laundered. And just bringing it back to the reason for Veriff is if those accounts don't exist, if they can't set them up, they can't do this, right? So you're stopping something a few steps back, which is really, really interesting. And the final thing, and this again is happening everywhere, is with digitization, the kind of weakest link in the chain, if you want to call it that, ends up being the human in the process. And this is just unfortunate, but it's a truth, right? It's the same thing we've seen in lots of other industries. When you block off the avenues, this ROI, when you block the ROI for the fraudsters, they change tactics and they tend to go to the next weakest link. And what we found is because technology has done such a good job at stopping a lot of these things, the fraudsters, unfortunately, now are targeting directly the humans involved. So I think that is probably the biggest trend and maybe the most concerning trend for the public that we've seen across all of financial crime and non-financial crime. Scams are on the rise. People are the targets now. And, thankfully, there are still a lot of tools that we can use to protect people, but people do need to be more aware of that, that they are the targets.
Yeah, and you mentioned there sort of that scams are on the rise and so on, and there's obviously a rise in prevalence there. But why now? What are you thinking about is so sort of unique about this time in history where that would be the case?
Well, it comes back to those first 2 points. So digitization has put more services online. Think about opening bank accounts as a perfect example. Before you had to go into a physical location and validate yourself. Physical locations are risky for fraudsters. It puts them on the line, or they have to have somebody who they trust enough to go and do this for them. And that's a lot more work than simply pulling up a web page and registering, right? So that enables them to do more of it. But the fact is that once we start to put in technologies like Veriff, or when you think about logging into your bank account, there are technologies that look at the device that you're using and determine whether or not you think they think that this is actually you logging in. That does a very good job at stopping fraudsters. And once you do that, you force them to the next part of the chain. So you force them to scam humans. So again, digitization puts more services online. And then technology helps lock them down. The locks on the door are very good. So what do? You get the person who owns the actual key to open the door for you. And that's where the scams come in.
I see. That makes sense. And I think you sort of kind of alluded to this here, that there's almost two layers to this, isn't there? There's the business cost, if you like, and then the cost of the consumer or the end user, or whatever phrase you want to use, depending on what industry you're in. Obviously, for us at Veriff, we're dealing primarily with businesses, but it would be good to, I think, just to outline a little bit the sort of the negative impact, both for our customers and for their customers as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And, they're going to be pretty similar. At a very minimum, you're going to have either inconvenience for one of these customers or a bad experience. And, that is probably an unlikely scenario, because when you start to talk about fraud, an inconvenience is kind of the least of your worries. But, at the end of the day, that's kind of the lowest bar. At a maximum, the losses or the impacts are tremendous. So, for end customers, especially when you're thinking about financial services, loss of life savings is very common and very, very tragic when it happens. We have people who, again, they transfer out their entire pensions to a fraudster, thinking that they're doing an investment or they're keeping their money safe because the fraudsters are trying to attack it, or they found a love online that they've suddenly connected with. Those are three very, very common and tragic scenarios that absolutely can devastate people. For businesses, it can be the same, especially in the small, medium business world. If you end up paying an invoice to a fraudster for a few £100,000, dollars, whatever your currency, that can bankrupt you. That can really bankrupt you quickly. Because remember, not only have you paid that money away, but you still have to pay the original invoice, right? It doesn't go away. So suddenly you're 2x whatever you were supposed to be able to pay, and cash flow right away becomes an issue. So these types of businesses can absolutely be hit. And if you take it even to the kind of largest size of businesses, if you end up getting hit by these types of things and it doesn't look like you've done everything you can to prevent it, it's a very bad reputational impact that you can have. Not to mention things like fines for sanctions breaches, money laundering fines, terrorist financing, human trafficking. All of these things stem from the same issues that we're talking about, and so the real heavy end of this is a pretty terrible and tragic set of circumstances.
I guess just sort of turning that on its head a little bit then. Although, yes, I mean, that's obviously the very negative side of it. I guess there is a positive spin in this as well, because if you are very good, or you're seen as being very robust in your anti-fraud measures and so on, that could potentially be seen as sort of a customer acquisition strategy in a sense, because the customers, consumers, end users are going to trust you with their data and so on because you have that good reputation, presumably.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a funny thing to kind of say out loud, but a good fraud experience is actually a really powerful thing. Think about if you feel vulnerable that somebody might be trying to take advantage of you, and the business you're dealing with has your back and proactively calls you, or puts a pause on things while they sort things out. That can actually be a really, really powerful thing, because you step back after and you go, oh, wow, they actually just protected me from making potentially a huge mistake. So I think businesses that do that really well have that multiplier effect in terms of relationships. There was a really famous TV advert quite a few years ago, but they might still do it, for one of the banks that literally advertised their fraud service. And they had, these very cool adverts with swooping birds and things like that, effectively showing off that, look, we have all this cool technology. And I think that should be more normal. People should actually be proud of what they're doing to stop these types of attacks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to your point earlier on about sort of saying that it helps build trust. And I think that trust is such a fundamental sort of part of doing business online. I mean, doing business anyway, but especially in a sort of digital world, I would say. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you next to sort of bring out your crystal ball a little bit and just sort of give us some sort of looking, some forward-looking things here. But how do you see the sort of the threat of fraud evolving over the sort of the course of this year, but also into sort of next and beyond as well? And then specifically sort of looking, are there sort of new sectors that we need to consider here, or sort of evolving technology or something like that?
Yeah, so you're going to notice a theme, because I'll circle right back again to first digitization. So where is that going? What sectors are being affected by that most? That's going to be your most at-risk sector. So anything where we've done things a traditional way for a long time and are now moving digital, absolutely this could be potential. So the technology to do that will enable a lot more, but it'll also enable these threats from fraudsters. But we can combat that, right? So we need to stay on an equal footing with them as much as possible. So technology, the types of machine learning models that we use a lot in this industry behind the scenes to protect people, protect customers, that type of technology is critical, because it's not a set of static rules that is going to present something that's knowable by a fraudster. So a fraudster will probe your system until they basically figure out what's the rule for this and then go around it. Things like machine learning are much more powerful than that, because they don't just have a static set of rules that can be probed. Now, that being said, fraudsters also use this technology. So there's a lot of evidence of basically combative machine learning models that fraudsters will train on our customers or our models. So they will basically use the output they get to train their own model. And so you start to get into a bit of AI warfare between the two sides, which again is why it's so important to continue to invest in this, to continue to push that boundary forward so that we can stay on top of it. So I think that's the first thing. The other thing that I've seen starting to happen, and I think will continue, is your traditional forms of two-factor authentication, which typically these days often is a one-time password. They send you a text to your mobile. I think that is going to become less and less effective simply because think about the experience that we most have when we're doing, e-commerce online or something online. Quite often you have your mobile phone with you. You're doing it on your phone. You're logging into a website, and then that website wants to send you a code. If your device has been compromised, if the technology there, you don't have that separation. So the whole point of two-factor authentication was supposed to be a good separation between these two factors. You don't have that anymore. So wherever you have a compromised device, then suddenly the fraudster just has control over both of those things. So I think that will lead to new forms of attack, but also we'll need to implement new forms of this type of technology. So, using biometrics more, because it's not something, the collapse means less. It doesn't matter if I can intercept your one-time password. I don't have your face, for instance, and I can't prove that I'm live there doing that with you. So it starts to separate those two things again. So I think things like that, alongside things like digital ID, where that digital ID can be protected in a lot more secure, modern way than simply flashing a photo of a passport or a driver's license. You can actually have more biometric security wrapped around accessing that digital ID. So those types of things will be the ways that we're going to have to adapt to fight to these new problems that the fraudsters are bringing up. But really, it'll be based on technology and kind of the collapsed user experience into single devices.
That's fascinating. I mean, I completely agree with what you've said there. That's it's an ever evolving picture, isn't it? To be honest, and it's constantly moving. Do you think? I mean, that just by its nature of being so sort of fast moving, that it can be sometimes quite daunting, I think, for businesses to know what it is they should be doing and whether they are sort of ahead of the game. Where do they sort of benchmark themselves, I suppose, against their competitors and so on. So I think what we like to do with these episodes is to give some sort of very actionable stuff for people to take away and sort of put into practice, if you like. So do you have any sort of tips that that businesses could take away to avoid avoid these sorts of problems in the near term, to sort of minimize harm?
Yeah, so fraud is a tough one because I always like to talk about it in two kind of levels of hierarchy. So you've got your micro fraud trends and you've got your macro fraud trends. Now, micro fraud trends will be very, very specific to your business, to the time, and they will change a lot. These are things like, how much is a payment, a fraudulent payment, being set up for, or countries that maybe devices are coming in from. Those will change and cycle, and so there's nothing really that I can say that will help anybody protect that, except to make sure you're paying attention to all of those things. What you can do is start to think more about the kind of macro fraud trends. So these are things that are fundamental to how a fraudster has to operate to exploit your business. And they don't change very often. They change really if you introduce a major new service or a way of working with your service. But once they're in place, they stay pretty much there. So I would really encourage everybody to very carefully think about your business in these kind of macro fraud trends and micro fraud trends. And pay attention to the macro ones, especially if you're bringing out new products and services. Don't skimp on that. Don't get complacent and think, you know what, we've got to just launch and we'll figure it out later, because the fraudsters will figure it out very, very quickly, I promise you. So do take the time to really map out some of those macro trends and then put in place strategies to make that difficult for fraudsters. And then the micro trends kind of take care of themselves as long as you have good technology and good tools in place, right? So things that you can use to dynamically adapt your strategies to adapt to these trends as they change, as they ebb and flow. So the good technology, invest in good tech to kind of help fight the bad tech is I guess the way you would think about it. And you can do that at various parts of your business depending on on the business itself. There may be different interaction points throughout a flow of a user or the entire end-to-end journey of your business where you need to intercept with different types of technology. Make sure you've got some things in place along the way that you can do that.
I really like that sort of blend of sort of the strategy and the tools, and the two things sort of coming together to form the best sort of defense, I think. And how would you go about advising sort of folks within businesses that are trying to bring in these sort of solutions? Quite often they have to win some internal battles as well. Not everyone within the business will be convinced of the cost of fraud, for example. So what would be some takeaways for those types of folks in how to sort of get that internal buy-in to bring in security best practice, for example?
Yeah, well, we often think of fraud only as a bottom line issue. And absolutely it is. And like I was alluding to earlier, if you're, especially a small, medium-sized business and you get hit with a big fraud, it can absolutely bankrupt you and take you out. So it's important. But let's put that to one side. Let's imagine that that's not a major concern for you. I think you have to step back and think about what we were talking about earlier, customer experience, right? How are your customers going to feel if fraudsters are able to exploit them and succeed in a lot of these cases? How are you going to defend your reputation if those experiences start to be published online? How does that benchmark you against your peers? One step further along, how does that affect the regulations and your regulatory risk, right? Does that expose you to fines based on whatever industry you're in? And then I guess the final thing I always like to say is like the newspaper test, right? If the headline got into one of these newspapers that this has happened, how do you come across? Do you come across well? Does it look like you're doing everything you can? And it goes back to reputational risk. Once you're in the paper, the regulators pay a lot more attention to you. So, I think just tying it right through, like even if you can afford the bottom line impact to fraud, can you really afford all of those other things that happen after that?
Yeah, it definitely goes a lot further than beyond the sort of the tangible cost, if you like, into sort of this unknown or sort of almost priceless realm, isn't it, of not being able to sort of put a price on that stuff. But I just want to just jump on one point there, actually, around the sort of the customer experience piece, because I think there's maybe possibly a feeling that actually sometimes the measures that you put in place for fraud prevention can actually make the customer experience worse. There's more levels that people have to go through in order to sign up for a service and so on. How would you sort of counter that? What would you say about sort of making the sort of the customer onboarding process sort of not cumbersome enough that people will be dropping off and you'll be losing customers just to sort of save on fraud prevention?
Yeah, that's the eternal pendulum, let's call it. So it swings back from customer experience focus to risk prevention focus, and it's always going to be a moving thing. So I think the first thing to recognize is that it will move as your business changes, as the fraud landscape changes, as the customer landscape changes. You'll want to be able to swing that pendulum back and forth. You have to realize that there is a trade-off to be made, and so nothing comes for free. But you have to be able to be dynamic, and you have to be able to set that right trade-off ratio. Now, if you use better technology, you're going to be able to implement more strategies that have less impact on your customers. A lot of good technology these days is fairly invisible to the end user. You can do a lot by looking at the ways customers interact with your services without them even being aware of that. That kind of tech gives you a whole new stack of data to work with your tools underneath that we mentioned before, these flexible tools that let you tune your micro strategies. If you can gather all of that data and make better decisions with it, you can do that without the customer really ever knowing that it's happening. And that is one of the really good ways of being able to tighten up your security controls without putting, endless screens in front of customers. Now, sometimes you have to put new screens in front of customers. Sometimes the friction just has to be there. And so doing it in a way that's conscientious of them, that doesn't feel cumbersome, but also, like we talked about earlier, also feels like you've got their back. That can be actually a very powerful thing, and it can help them feel more trustful with your service, right? It helps gain that trust. So definitely, don't shy away from it completely, because it can actually be really beneficial, especially if you're entering into business with a customer that is a high trust business. If you're asking them to give you money, if you're asking them to give you sensitive information, you want them to think that you're doing everything you can to protect that, because you are.
Absolutely. And I think research that we've done here at Veriff has sort of shown that actually customers are prepared to tolerate a certain sort of a couple of extra screens that they have to go through if it brings better fraud protection in the long term. So I think that sometimes we underestimate customers, don't we? And maybe this is just one of those instances. But what would be some resources for sort of businesses out there that are looking at either enhancing or even building from scratch their sort of their fraud prevention strategy? Where would be the best place for them to start, do you think?
Yeah, so I mentioned before kind of doing an end-to-end risk assessment of your business. I think start there. Identify these pieces that you need to be careful of, the kind of risk areas that you see, and then think about what data can you bring into those parts of the journey to help you make decisions. And we talked a lot about technology and having good technology, so that's absolutely critical. But don't be afraid to explore with the vendor partners that you're working with. What more can they do? How can you tweak and customize things? What suggestions do they have? Remember, vendors in their space are experts at what they do. They deal with it across hundreds, thousands of different businesses. So we're looking at this type of thing all the time. So we might have ideas and ways of thinking about it that you haven't thought about yet, and we may be able to help you come up with some new and unique strategies. So, really work with your partners. And finally, there are publications and things online that publish fraud figures. Certainly if you're in the financial services space, and in the UK, there are actually a lot of really good publications that come out. Fraud the Facts by UK Finance is one that I always like to look at, which gives a really nice breakdown of the trends that the industry are seeing, changes over time, the actual attack vectors that they're seeing. Now, this is very payments focused, but that might help you, again, think of strategies to make sure that you're not vulnerable. And I'm sure that there are other similar publications in different verticals as well.
Absolutely, and just rather shamelessly, I'm going to plug our own here actually, because the Veriff 2023 fraud report is available. It contains a lot of the information about some of the trends we've just discussed today, strategies to combat them, and so on. That's available to download on our website, and we'll try to find a place to put the link around this podcast too. So good to just in closing, I suppose, just sort of summarise, if you like, then the most important tenet of an anti-fraud strategy. Security strategy, sort of why it matters and how best to implement it, just in closing.
Sure, yeah. So I'll bring together three critical points that we have touched on throughout the discussion. So firstly, don't ever assume that the fraudsters will not know everything about your business. Okay, it's a scary thing to say, but you really should assume that they'll know the critical details of your business, various limits and approaches to security that you have. So treat that as a known, but work with that as your baseline. So if you consider that to be your baseline, then what do? You need to implement good modern technology on top of that, so that even if they know these things, you still have plenty of ways of putting these roadblocks in front of them. So, using things like machine learning as opposed to just static rules. These combined with strategies that you can tweak and tune and be dynamic with will allow you to shift with them and to kind of continue playing this cat and mouse game. So I think the dynamic strategies, dynamic technology, as well as multi-layered. So there is no silver bullet in this game. I'm afraid if there was one single solution that could stop everything, everyone would have it. It doesn't exist. Instead, what you need is a series of solutions along the way. So look for vendors that have multiple layers of solution that you can implement. It makes your lives easier if you don't have to go to multiple parties to do this, but look for multiple layers and put layers at every point in that journey that you've identified that there's a potential risk. And then finally, as we talked about customer experience, get it right. Make sure that you've considered how you're going to impact your legitimate customers, because there will be some impact. It's inevitable. So think about that very, very carefully. Tailor it. Make sure you are really demonstrating the trust that they should have in you, and showing them that you're doing this because you want to protect them. And that will really pay dividends in the future.
Excellent. I really like that. That's it's a very good sort of summary, and I think that kind of, there's no one and done approach to this, is there? It's going to be an ongoing sort of battle, as you say. It's an ever evolving picture. Fraudsters always seem to be staying one step ahead somehow. So hopefully, if it's okay with you, David, you can come back and join us in a few months' time just to sort of update on where we are, and we can make sure that we can keep people abreast of the most recent information from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe we review our next fraud report when it comes out. That could be interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds like a plan. Like it. Okay, well, look, David, thanks very much for joining us. There's some really good information there, some very insightful stuff, and some good takeaways for folks as well. And I'll just close by saying thank you ever so much for your time. Much appreciated. And we'll see us next time.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.